The great hall had never felt so cold. June stood at the edge of the celebration, her spine straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her worn linen dress, and she told herself, for the 4th time that evening, that she would not cry. The candles burning in the iron chandeliers above cast a warm amber glow across the stone floor, across the silk gowns and the polished boots, and the laughing faces of every noble family in the kingdom of Veldrath. The air smelled of roasted pheasant and mulled wine and expensive perfume, and it felt entirely foreign to her skin. She did not belong here. She had always known that. But tonight, surrounded by it, the knowledge pressed against her chest like a cold stone. The presenting ball. Once every 7 years, the AlphaKing summoned every eligible Omega in the kingdom to the great hall of Castle Veldrath. It was tradition. It was law. The AlphaKing would walk among them, and if the bond stirred, if the ancient pull of fate recognized its match, he would choose his queen. June had not come with hope. She had come because her father had commanded it, and because refusing a royal summons carried consequences her family could not afford. Her gray wool cloak was too plain for this room. She knew it the moment she had stepped through the iron-banded doors and seen the other women, daughters of noble houses, draped in deep crimson and forest green and midnight blue, their hair pinned with silver combs and threaded with ribbon. They gleamed. June's long blonde braid hung simply over one shoulder, tied with a strip of plain leather at the bottom, and her dress, though clean, was the same one she wore to the village market. She had pressed the wrinkles out of it herself that morning, with a warm iron stone wrapped in cloth. It had not been enough. "You should stand closer to the back," said a voice beside her, sweet as poisoned honey. June turned. Her sister Mara had appeared at her elbow, wearing a gown of deep rose silk that their father had commissioned 3 weeks ago specifically for this evening. Mara's dark hair was piled elaborately atop her head, threaded with seed pearls. She was beautiful, genuinely, undeniably beautiful. And she knew it the way a sharpened blade knows its own edge. "I was simply finding a comfortable place to stand," June said, keeping her voice even. Mara's pale eyes swept over her once, the way one looks at something mildly unfortunate left out in the rain. "You have mud on your boot," she said. "Did you walk from the gate?" The carriage wheel cracked on the east road. "Of course it did." Mara exhaled through her nose, a delicate sound of disdain. She glanced around the room, making certain several nearby young women could hear her before she spoke again. "June, look at yourself. Look at this room." She gestured with one silk-gloved hand at the splendor surrounding them. "Nobody wants you here. You are an Omega without rank, without a noble house worth mentioning, without anything to offer a man of standing, let alone a king." Her voice dropped, but did not soften. "Nobody wants you. You should have stayed home." The words landed precisely where Mara had aimed them. June said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not give her sister the satisfaction of a reaction. She turned her gaze back toward the great hall, toward the candles and the music, and the women who belonged in this world, and she breathed in slowly through her nose, wood smoke, tallow, the faint iron scent of old stone, and she held herself together with the quiet stubbornness that had always been her only armor. The herald's horn sounded. 3 long, resonant notes that cut through the music and the conversation like a blade through silk. Every voice in the hall went silent. Every head turned toward the great double doors at the far end of the room, doors that stood twice the height of a man and were carved from ancient black oak, reinforced with iron bolts worn smooth by centuries of hands. They opened without sound. He did not enter the way other men entered rooms. He did not stride or swagger or make a performance of his arrival. He simply walked. And yet the room changed around him the moment he crossed the threshold. the way weather changes when a storm front moves in from the mountains. The air itself seemed to shift. King Draven of Veldrath. He was taller than June had imagined from the stories. His black leather armor caught the candlelight along its edges, the crossed straps across his broad chest casting shadows in sharp lines. His long, dark braids fell over the black fur mantle at his shoulders, and his eyes, even from this distance, even across the width of the great hall, were the unsettling pale blue of deep winter sky, the kind of sky that warns of snow. There was a faint scar along his left jaw, a thin white line that had healed years ago but never fully faded. His expression was unreadable, not cold exactly, simply closed, the way a fortress is closed, every gate down, every shutter drawn. He walked through the hall with 2 guards flanking him at a respectful distance, and the assembled women parted before him like water. June watched from her corner. She watched him move through the crowd with the measured patience of a man performing a duty he had not chosen. He paused before daughters of great houses. He inclined his head politely. He spoke brief words she could not hear from where she stood. He was courteous and controlled, and utterly, entirely distant, as though some invisible wall of thick stone stood between him and every woman in the room. The bond, they said, could not be forced. Either the ancient pull awakened in the blood, or it did not. And from where June stood, watching his careful, closed face move through the crowd, she thought, not for the first time, that perhaps some people were simply not built for it, that perhaps some alphas had closed themselves so thoroughly against the world that even fate could not find a door. She was still thinking this when his eyes crossed the room and found her. It was not a glance. It was not the passing sweep of a gaze moving from one face to the next. It was a stillness, a sudden, complete stillness, as though the room had ceased to exist for him in that single moment. And there was only her, standing at the edge of the candlelight in her plain gray cloak, her blonde braid over one shoulder, her hands folded, her chin slightly lifted despite everything. June's heart did something strange and small inside her chest. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she had imagined it. And then King Draven crossed the room. Not toward the daughter of Lord Ashenvale, who stood 3 steps to June's left, in a gown of deep emerald. Not toward Lady Corrin of the Eastern Reach, whose beauty had been written about in the kingdom's broadsheets. He crossed the room in a straight, unhesitating line, past the silk and the jewels and the carefully arranged hair, and he stopped directly in front of June. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. The scent of him reached her first, pine resin and cold iron and something beneath it, something ancient and warm that she had no name for. His pale blue eyes studied her face with an attention that felt almost unbearable. The entire hall had gone utterly still. Mara, 3 steps away, had turned to stone. The king did not bow. Kings did not bow. But he tilted his head, a fraction, in a gesture that somehow felt more personal than ceremony. And then he spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "You are trying very hard not to let them see that you are hurting," he said. Not a question, not a pleasantry, simply a truth, spoken plainly, as though he had looked directly through her careful posture and her steady hands and seen the cold stone pressing against her chest. June's breath caught. She held his gaze, because looking away felt suddenly like the most dangerous thing she could do. "I am managing," she said quietly. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile. Something older and more complicated than a smile. "I know," he said. "I have been watching you manage since you walked through those doors." And June understood in that moment that the evening had just become something else entirely, something she had no map for, no preparation for, no armor sufficient to face. Behind her, she heard Mara draw a sharp, disbelieving breath. The silence in the great hall lasted 3 full heartbeats. Then, like a dam giving way, the whispers began. June heard them at the edges of her awareness, soft, urgent, incredulous. The rustle of silk as women leaned toward one another, the barely concealed gasps from the daughters of noble houses who had spent months preparing for this very night. She did not look at them. She could not afford to look away from the pale blue eyes that held her own, with an attention so complete it felt like being seen for the first time in her life. King Draven had not moved. He stood before her with that same stillness. Not the stillness of a man waiting, but the stillness of a mountain. Something that simply was, unmoved by wind or noise or the breathless staring of an entire hall. "What is your name?" he asked. "June." She hesitated only a half-second. "June Ashford, my king. My father holds a small parcel of land in the Greywood Valley. We are not—" She stopped herself. She'd been about to say "we are not important," and something in the steadiness of his gaze made the words feel wrong on her tongue. "June," he repeated, as though testing the weight of it. He said nothing else for a moment. Then, "Will you walk with me?" It was phrased as a question. June understood, with perfect clarity, that it was not one. Kings did not ask. And yet, and this was the thing that unsettled her most, his tone had carried something genuine in it. Not command, not performance. Something that sounded quietly, like he actually wanted her answer. "Yes," she said. He offered his arm. She placed her hand on the leather bracer at his forearm. The material was cool and worn smooth, the buckles of dark iron, and he turned and led her along the edge of the great hall. The crowd parted before them, the way it had parted for him alone when he entered, and June felt every gaze in the room track their movement like compass needles finding north. She kept her chin level. She focused on the gray stone floor beneath her boots, on the warmth of the candles in their iron stands, on the distant sound of the musicians who had, after a moment of shocked silence, resumed playing. Something slower now, something uncertain. "You do not look pleased," Draven said beside her, his voice low beneath the music. "I am surprised," she answered honestly. "I did not expect to be noticed this evening." "Why not?" She considered lying. It would have been easier. A modest deflection, something polite and forgettable. But his question had been direct, and there was something about the way he asked it that made her feel that he would know the difference. "Because I am nothing remarkable," she said. "Not by the measure of this room." He was quiet for a moment. They had reached the far end of the hall, where a narrow archway led to a stone corridor, torches burning in iron brackets along the walls, the noise of the celebration softening behind them. A guard stepped forward instinctively, and stopped at a single look from Draven. The man retreated 2 paces and turned his back, granting them what passed for privacy in a royal castle. "And by your own measure?" Draven asked. June looked up at him. The torchlight caught the scar along his jaw, the hard line of his cheekbones, the faint shadows beneath his eyes that suggested a man who had not slept well in some time. She had expected a king to look triumphant. He looked instead like someone who was very tired and had learned to carry it without complaint. "I don't know yet," she admitted. He studied her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "That is the most honest answer I have received all evening." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor behind them. Sharp, deliberate, the sound of someone who had followed with purpose. June turned. Lord Edric Vane stood at the entrance of the corridor. He was a large man, broad across the chest, with close-cropped silver hair, and the bearing of someone who had spent decades expecting rooms to rearrange themselves around him. He was the king's chief advisor, and June had seen his face on the broadsheets enough times to recognize him immediately. His expression, as his gaze moved from the king to June and back again, was the precise opposite of welcoming. "My king." His voice was smooth and careful, the voice of a man who had long practice at saying things that meant something other than what they appeared to say. "Forgive the interruption. Lady Corrin of the Eastern Reach has been waiting to be presented. Her father is Lord Edwin Corrin, your closest border ally. It would be diplomatically significant to—" "I am aware of Lord Edwin's daughter," Draven said. His tone did not change. He did not raise his voice or sharpen it. He simply spoke, and the words arrived with the weight of a stone wall. "She will be greeted before the evening ends." Lord Edric's gaze moved to June again, and she felt it, the assessment, the dismissal, the rapid and efficient calculation of her worth by a man who measured everything in political currency. Whatever he found, it was evidently insufficient. His expression remained courteous, but his eyes were cold. "Of course, my king," he said. He bowed and withdrew, but the look he gave June as he turned, brief, almost imperceptible, was not a bow. It was a warning. June filed it carefully away. They returned to the great hall, and the evening continued. But it continued differently now. Women who had not glanced at June before now watched her with open curiosity and barely veiled resentment. The daughters of noble houses murmured behind their hands. Mara, when June passed near her, stood rigid with an expression so tightly controlled it looked like a mask that had been pressed on too hard. She said nothing to June, but her silence was louder than anything she had said before. Draven remained at June's side for the better part of an hour. He introduced her to no one formally. There would be time for formality later, and both of them seemed to sense, without discussing it, that the evening had already moved into territory that protocol had not prepared anyone for. He asked her questions instead. About Greywood Valley, the pine forests that ran along the eastern ridge, the cold springs that fed into the lower river, the small village where she had grown up learning the names of every herb that grew in the meadows, because the nearest healer had been 3 leagues away, and her mother had believed in knowing things. He listened in a way that was different from being politely attended to. He actually listened, his pale eyes still and focused, no glance toward the room, no distracted scanning of the crowd for something more important. June had not been listened to like that in a very long time. "You speak of your mother in the past," he said at one point. "She died 4 winters ago," June said. "Lung fever." "I am sorry. She was—" June paused, searching for the right word, and settled on the truest one. "She was brave. She faced everything without flinching. I have tried to learn from that." Something shifted in his expression, something she could not fully read, some emotion moving briefly behind the closed surface of his face before he drew it back. "I lost my father when I was 17, he said. It was offered simply, without preamble or ceremony. Not a confidence designed to impress her, just a thing that was true, offered in exchange for a thing she had made true by saying it aloud. I understand trying to learn from the dead." June looked at him. This king who held a kingdom in his hands and slept badly and carried something heavy and unspoken in his jaw and his eyes, and she thought, dangerously. She knew it was dangerous, that she understood something about him, that this room full of silk and seed pearls did not. The evening ended with the herald's horn again, 3 notes in reverse order, signaling the formal close of the presenting ball. The guests began to move toward the doors, the low roar of conversation rising as the tension of royal ceremony dissolved back into ordinary noise. Draven turned to her before she could step away. "I will send word to your father tomorrow," he said. June's heart turned over in her chest. She knew what that meant. Everyone in the kingdom knew what that meant. She nodded, carefully, because her voice was not entirely reliable at that moment. He inclined his head to her, that same slight gesture she had seen at the beginning of the evening, and then he turned and walked back toward the great doors, his guards falling into step around him. June stood still in the emptying hall. And then a hand closed around her wrist, fingers tight, nails pressing slightly through the fabric of her sleeve. "What did you do?" Mara's voice was barely above a whisper, but the fury in it was absolute. Her dark eyes were bright with something that had moved beyond jealousy into something rawer and colder. "What did you do to make him notice you?" June looked at her sister's hand on her wrist. Then she looked up at Mara's face. "Nothing," she said quietly. "I simply stood there and told the truth." She removed her wrist from her sister's grip, gently but completely, and she walked toward the doors of the great hall with her blonde braid over her shoulder and her worn boots on the stone floor, and the feeling, fragile and frightening and entirely new, that something had just begun. The messenger arrived at the Ashford house before dawn had fully broken. June heard the knock from her small room at the back of the cottage. 3 sharp raps on the heavy oak door, the sound cutting through the gray morning silence like a stone dropped into still water. She was already awake. She had not slept well. She had lain in the narrow bed beneath her wool blanket and stared at the ceiling beams and listened to the wind move through the pine branches outside her window and tried, with limited success, to make sense of the evening before. She heard her father's footsteps cross the main room, the creak of the door, a murmured exchange, then silence. Then her father's voice, oddly careful. "June." She rose. She pulled her gray cloak over her linen dress, and she crossed the cold stone floor in her bare feet, and she opened her door. Her father, Edmund Ashford, stood in the center of the main room holding a sealed parchment. He was a lean man with a weathered face and gray threading through his brown beard, a man who had worked his small parcel of land every day since June could remember, and who showed his feelings the way men of the Greywood Valley showed most things, slowly, and only when he was certain of them. He was looking at the parchment in his hands as though it might be a living thing. The seal pressed into the dark wax was the crowned wolf of Veldrath. "It's from the castle," he said. He looked up at her. "June, what happened last evening?" she told him. Plainly, without embellishment, the way her mother had taught her to relay important things, clearly and in order, so that the listener could understand without having to fill in gaps themselves. She told him about standing at the edge of the hall, about Mara's words, about the king crossing the room. Her father listened with his weathered face very still, and when she finished, he looked down at the parchment again and turned it over in his hands. "Open it," she said quietly. He broke the seal. The letter was brief. It bore the signature of Lord Edric Vane. Not the king's hand, June noted, but the king's chief advisor, and it requested in formal language that nonetheless carried the weight of stone, that Miss June Ashford of Greywood Valley present herself at Castle Veldrath within 3 days' time, there to be considered as a formal candidate for the position of Queen Consort of the kingdom. Her father sat down heavily on the wooden bench beside the hearth. The fire had burned low overnight, and the room smelled of cold ash and pine resin drifting in under the door. 3 days, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a crow called once from the direction of the upper pines, and the wind answered it. Then Edmund Ashford looked at his daughter with eyes that held something she had not often seen in them, something that was not quite pride, because pride was too simple for what it was. It was closer to awe, and it sat on his face with the careful uncertainty of a man who did not know what to do with it. Your mother would have known what to say right now, he told her. June crossed the room and sat beside him on the bench, and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, the way she had when she was small. He put his arm around her without a word. They sat together in the cold morning room with the low fire and the crow outside, and the parchment resting on his knee, and neither of them spoke. And it was enough. Mara did not come down to breakfast. She did not come down for the midday meal either. June heard her moving behind her closed door. The sharp sound of something set down too hard on a wooden surface, the muffled tension of someone pacing. By the time the afternoon light had turned the color of old honey through the cottage windows, June had packed what she owned into a single leather traveling satchel. 2 dresses, her warmest cloak, a small knife for practical use, a bundle of dried herbs her mother had pressed and labeled in careful script, and the thin silver bracelet that had been her mother's, worn smooth on the inner side from years of wear. She was fastening the buckle on the satchel when Mara appeared in the doorway. She had composed herself. That was the thing about Mara. She was always composed when it counted. Her dark hair was brushed, her expression arranged into something that resembled sisterly concern. And if June had not known her entire life, she might have been deceived by it. "You understand what you are walking into," Mara said. It was not a question. "I understand that I have been summoned," June replied, without looking up from the buckle. "You understand that Lord Edric Vane will not allow this." Mara stepped into the room, lowering her voice as though they were conspiring together, which they were not. "He has been arranging an alliance with the Corrin family for 2 years. Lady Corrin was meant to be chosen. There are treaties involved, trade agreements, things you know nothing about and care nothing about because you have spent your life learning herb names in a meadow." June looked up then. She studied her sister's face, the dark eyes, the careful expression, the thing beneath the expression that Mara would never admit to and June would never name aloud. "What is it that you actually want to say to me?" June asked. Mara's composure flickered. Just for a moment, a crack in the surface, something raw and hot beneath it. Then it sealed again. "I want to say that you are making a mistake," she said, "and that when it goes wrong, and it will go wrong, do not expect anyone at that castle to help you." June closed her satchel. She stood and lifted it by the strap and slung it over her shoulder. Then she looked at her sister one final time. "I have never expected anyone to help me," she said. "You taught me that." She left before Mara could answer. Castle Veldrath from the outside was a thing of severe beauty. Walls of dark gray stone that had stood for 4 centuries, towers that caught the clouds, the great iron gate hanging open like a jaw. June arrived at midday on the 2nd day, having traveled by borrowed cart along the King's Road through the pine forest, the cold air smelling of frozen earth and wood smoke from the villages they had passed. A steward met her at the gate, a beta male of middle age with a neat brown beard and efficient, courteous manner. His name was Aldrich, and he showed her to a set of guest quarters in the castle's east wing, without ceremony or small talk, which she appreciated. The room was larger than the entire ground floor of her family's cottage. There was a real hearth with a real fire already burning, a wide bed with wool blankets and a fur coverlet, a wooden table with a clay pitcher of water and a basin, and a narrow window overlooking the castle's inner courtyard. The stone floor was covered in a woven rug of dark blue and brown, worn soft with age. June set her satchel on the floor beside the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and breathed. She had been there perhaps an hour, long enough to wash the road dust from her face and hands, to change into her second dress, a slightly better wool in a shade of warm gray, and to pin her braid up into something that looked intentional rather than simply practical, when the knock came at her door. She expected Aldrich, or perhaps a servant with food. She opened the door to Lord Edric Vane. He stood in the corridor with 2 guards behind him, and his hands clasped in front of him, and his expression carrying the same careful courtesy she had seen in the torchlight of the corridor at the ball. In the daylight, he looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, the silver of his hair sharper, and no less formidable. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I hope your journey was comfortable." "It was," she said. She did not step back from the doorway. His gaze moved past her briefly into the room, assessing, cataloging. and then returned to her face. "I wonder if I might speak with you plainly," he said, as one straightforward person to another. June recognized the construction. It was the kind of sentence that preceded the kind of conversation designed to make her feel that agreeing was the reasonable choice. She had heard it before, from men in the village who wanted her father's land at prices that were not fair. "Of course," she said. Lord Edric smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "You are a woman of good character, I am certain," he began, "but you must understand that a king's choice of consort is not merely a personal matter. It is a political one. Kingdoms stand or fall on the alliances forged through marriage. Lady Corrin brings with her the full military and trade support of the Eastern Reach, 20,000 soldiers, June, and the only navigable river passed through the Keldrath Mountains." He paused. "What does Greywood Valley bring?" June held his gaze steadily. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I suspect the king is capable of deciding that for himself." Something moved through Lord Edric's expression. Surprise, quickly suppressed, and beneath the surprise, the first cold edge of genuine displeasure. "You are very composed for a woman in your position," he said. "I have had practice," she replied. He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, the way a man nods when he has understood something he did not expect to understand, and files it away. "Good evening, Miss Ashford," he said. He turned and walked back down the corridor, his guards falling into step, and the sound of his boots on the stone faded into the castle's deep silence. June stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door and leaned against it, and let out a breath that had been waiting a long time to leave. Mara had been right about one thing. Lord Edric Vane would not make this easy. But as June crossed to the fire and held her cold hands toward the warmth of it, she found that she was not afraid. She was something else. Something she did not have a name for yet. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a pine forest at the beginning of winter, knowing the cold is coming, and choosing to stay anyway. She sat beside the fire. She unbraided her hair and began to rebraid it, slowly, her fingers moving through the familiar rhythm, and she watched the flames, and she thought about a man with pale blue eyes and a tired face who had listened to her speak about her mother and offered her something true in return. Whatever was coming, she would face it the way her mother had faced everything, without flinching. She met him again on the third morning. June had spent her first full day at Castle Veldrath, learning its rhythms the way she had always learned unfamiliar things, quietly, through observation, without drawing attention to herself. She walked the corridors that she was permitted to walk. She noted which servants moved with ease, and which moved with the careful wariness of people accustomed to being watched. She ate the meals brought to her room by a young beta girl named Wren, who had a gap between her front teeth and the habit of speaking in a rush, as though words were birds she was afraid would escape before she finished releasing them. Wren told her things without meaning to. That Lord Edric had held 2 closed meetings with the castle's war council since the ball. That Lady Corrin and her father had arrived at the castle the previous evening and been given quarters in the west wing. The better wing, the one with the larger hearths and the south-facing windows that caught the afternoon light. That the king had not attended the evening meal, and had instead spent the night in the strategy chamber with his maps and his silence. On the second evening, June had stood at her narrow window and watched snow begin to fall on the inner courtyard below. Soft and unhurried, the flakes drifting through the torchlight like ash from a distant fire. The castle's stone walls gathered the cold and held it, and she had pulled her wool cloak tight around her shoulders and watched the snow cover the cobblestones and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of rest. On the third morning, she rose before dawn, dressed in her warm gray dress and her cloak, and went to find the castle's herb garden. She had asked Wren about it the evening before, and Wren had told her, in her rapid, breathless way, that there was indeed a small walled garden on the castle's north side, maintained by the head healer, an elderly Omega woman named Sarah, who had served the castle for 40 years. Most people avoided the north garden in winter, Wren had said, because it caught no sun, and the stone walls held the cold, like a cistern holds water. But June had grown up in the Greywood Valley, where the winters came early and stayed late, and cold was simply weather. The garden was exactly as Wren had described, small, walled, north-facing, and almost entirely empty of human presence at this hour. The snow from the night before had settled on the bare earth in thin patches, and the skeletal remains of summer herbs stood in their rows like small gray monuments. June crouched beside the nearest bed and brushed snow away from a cluster of dried stems, recognizing them by their shape and the faint ghost of scent that even winter could not entirely silence. Feverfew, dried but intact. She pinched a small amount between her fingers and brought it to her nose. Still good. The head healer will either be very pleased or very offended that you found that before she did. June stood and turned. King Draven stood at the entrance of the walled garden, wearing a heavy cloak of dark wool over his leather armor, his long black braids pulled back from his face. No guards, no attendants. He was alone, and he looked, she noticed immediately, as though he had not slept again. The shadows beneath his pale blue eyes had deepened, and there was a tension around his jaw that she recognized as something carried from the inside. "My king," she said, inclining her head. "Draven," he said. Then, when she looked up at him, "Here, in this garden, before the castle wakes, I would prefer Draven." June considered this for a moment. It was not a small thing he was offering. Names were intimacy, and intimacy from a king was a gift with weight attached to it. She accepted it the way she accepted all things of weight, carefully and with both hands. "Draven," she said. He came into the garden and stopped a few paces from her, looking at the rows of dried herbs with an expression that might have been curiosity, or might have been something else, something using curiosity as a surface. The snow crunched softly under his boots. The morning was very still, the sky the pale gray of old pewter, the air sharp and clean and carrying the faint mineral smell of frozen stone. "You came to the garden instead of remaining in your room," he said. "I needed something familiar," she replied. "Herbs are familiar." He nodded. "Sarah, the head healer, she speaks of this garden the way other people speak of family." He paused. "She was the one who tended my father in his final months. She stayed with him through 3 nights when no one else could bear to." June looked at him. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She is." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dried stems with a dry, papery whisper. Then, "She told me, when I was 18 and had just taken the crown, and did not know what to do with it, that the only way to hold a kingdom without breaking it is to understand what it needs rather than what it owes you." He looked at June. "I have thought about that almost every day since." "Do you think she was right?" "I think she was right, and that it is the hardest thing I have ever tried to do," he said, with a directness that seemed to cost him something, as though he did not say such things often, and the muscles for it were not well exercised. June turned back to the herb bed. She crouched again and examined a cluster of dried rosemary, its needles still holding their gray-green color beneath the frost. She worked as she spoke, her fingers gentle on the stems. "Lord Edric came to my room on the evening I arrived," she said. She felt rather than saw the stillness that moved through him. "What did he say?" Draven's voice was careful now, not cold, but precise, the way a man speaks when he is controlling his reaction. "That Lady Corrin brings 20,000 soldiers and a mountain river pass," June said. "And that Greywood Valley brings nothing of comparable value." She glanced up at him. He was not wrong about the numbers. "No," Draven agreed. He was not wrong about the numbers. "He is trying to protect the kingdom," she said. "I understand that. I am not angry with him for it." Draven crouched beside her. A surprising thing, a king crouching in a frosted herb garden beside a woman in a wool cloak, and looked at the rosemary she was examining. Up close, the scar along his jaw was more visible, a thin line running from his cheekbone toward his chin. She did not ask about it. There would be time for asking about it, or there would not. "He is trying to protect what he believes the kingdom needs," Draven said. "There is a difference. He believes a kingdom runs on soldiers and trade routes, and he is not entirely wrong." He paused. "But he has never understood that a king who holds only the borders of his land and not the trust of his people holds nothing at all." June looked at him. "Is that why you crossed the room?" He met her eyes, and there it was again. That thing she had seen at the ball, that quality of complete attention, as though every other thing in the world had temporarily ceased to matter. "I crossed the room," he said slowly, "because in a hall full of women performing what they thought I wanted to see, you were the only one simply standing there being exactly who you are. And I have been surrounded by performance for so long that I had almost forgotten what the other thing felt like." The cold morning held them both in its gray stillness. June looked down at the rosemary in her hands. Her heart was doing something complicated, and she was trying to be sensible about it, because she was a practical woman, and she knew that mornings in herb gardens were not the same as the rest of life, and that kings who spoke beautifully in cold gardens were still kings, with all the weight and danger that word carried. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I am not performing now either. Which means that what I say to you is true, and what I do not say is also true." She looked up at him. "I am afraid of this castle, of Lord Edric, of what happens to a woman who is chosen and then found to be insufficient. I am afraid of all of it." He did not tell her there was nothing to fear. She had expected him to. Expected the reassurance that men in power often offered because it was easier than acknowledging the fear. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So am I." She stared at him. "I have been king for 11 years, he said. "I have led 3 campaigns, settled 2 succession crises, and held this kingdom together through a winter famine that killed 400 people in the northern provinces." He looked at her steadily. "And I am afraid that I will make the wrong choice, that I have already made too many wrong choices, that the weight of what I owe this kingdom is greater than what I am capable of giving." The honesty of it struck her like cold water, bracing and clarifying and impossible to look away from. Before either of them could speak again, footsteps sounded in the corridor beyond the garden wall. 2 sets, heavy, purposeful. Draven rose smoothly, and June rose beside him, and by the time the castle guard appeared at the garden entrance, they were standing a proper and unremarkable distance apart, both of them looking at the herb beds with expressions of polite interest. The guard, a broad beta with a red cloak, bowed his head. "My king, Lord Edric requests your presence in the Great Hall. Lord Corrin has arrived with his full retinue and asks for formal acknowledgement." Draven's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Tell Lord Edric I will be there within the quarter hour." The guard withdrew. Draven turned to June. Something moved across his face, not quite frustration, not quite apology. Something that understood, precisely, the shape of the interruption and what it meant. "June," he said. "Go," she said quietly. "The kingdom does not stop for herb gardens." He held her gaze for 1 moment longer. Then he turned and walked toward the garden entrance, his dark cloak moving around his boots. And he paused at the entrance without turning back. "Syrah takes her morning tea in the healing chamber at the castle's south end," he said. "Tell her I sent you. She will have things to teach you if you are willing to learn." He left. June stood alone in the frosted garden, the dried rosemary still in her hand, and she listened to his footsteps fade into the stone corridors of the castle. Then she heard something else, a sound from above, from the narrow walkway that ran along the top of the garden wall. She looked up. Lady Corin stood at the walkway's edge, looking down at her. She was exactly as beautiful as the broadsheets had suggested. Dark red hair, sharp green eyes, a fur-trimmed cloak of deep emerald that cost more than everything June owned combined. She was perhaps 25, and she wore her beauty with the ease of someone who had never once considered that it might not be enough. She looked at June for a long moment. Her expression was not cruel exactly. It was something more unsettling than cruelty. It was pity. "You should go home," Lady Corin said. Her voice was even and not unkind, which somehow made it worse. "I do not say this to be unkind. I say it because Lord Edric will destroy you before he allows you to take what he has spent 2 years building." She paused. "Whatever the king said to you this morning, he means it. I believe he means it. But meaning something and being able to do it are not the same thing." She pulled her cloak tighter against the cold. "Go home, little Omega, before this castle swallows you whole." She turned and walked away along the walkway, her boots quiet on the stone. June stood in the silent garden, the cold pressing in from the walls, the gray sky flat and close above her. She looked down at the rosemary in her hand, and then she walked toward the castle's south end to find a healer named Sarah and learn whatever she was willing to teach. Sarah was exactly what June had hoped she would be. She was small and white-haired, and moved through her healing chamber the way water moves through a familiar riverbed, unhurried, certain of every turn, wasting nothing. The chamber itself was warm and low-ceilinged, smelling of dried lavender and beeswax, and the faint copper trace of old medicines. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters in careful rows. Clay pots lined the shelves in an order that looked chaotic, but revealed itself, gradually, to be deeply intentional. When June appeared in the doorway and said that the king had sent her, Sarah looked her over once, the way a healer looks at a patient, seeing past the surface into the thing beneath. And then she turned back to the mortar she was grinding and said, "Sit down and tell me what you know about willow bark." June sat. She told her. By the time the morning had turned to midday, they had spoken for 3 hours, and June had ground 2 batches of dried herbs, identified a mislabeled pot of foxglove that Sarah had placed there deliberately to test her, and learned 3 things about treating winter fever that she had not known before. Sarah asked sharp questions and accepted imprecise answers, with the tolerant disapproval of someone who knew the difference between ignorance and carelessness, and was only impatient with the latter. At midday, Sarah poured 2 cups of tea from a battered iron pot and set one in front of June without asking if she wanted it. "Lord Edric came to see me this morning," Sarah said, settling onto her stool. June looked up. "He wanted to know if I had spoken with you." Sarah wrapped both small hands around her cup. "I told him I had not, because at the time I had not." This was technically accurate. Her eyes, dark and sharp beneath their white brows, held a quality of amusement that had survived 40 years in a royal castle without being worn away. "He is worried." "I know," June said. "He is not a bad man," Sarah said, which surprised June enough that she showed it. The old healer shook her head slightly. "He is a man who has spent 30 years keeping this kingdom from falling apart through careful arrangement of its pieces, and he has become so accustomed to arranging the pieces that he has forgotten they are people." She sipped her tea. "He arranged the Corin Alliance piece by piece over 2 years. He is watching it be unmade in 3 days, and he does not know how to stop it without crossing the king directly." "Can he stop it?" June asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "He will try something," she said finally. "That is not a prediction. That is 40 years of observation." She looked at June steadily. "So, you must be careful. Not frightened, careful. There is a difference." June thought of her mother, who had made the same distinction. "What will he try?" she asked. "I don't know," Sarah said, "but I know what he fears most. He fears that the king will choose with his heart rather than his strategy. He fears that a woman from a valley no one has heard of will make Draven remember that he is a person before he is a king." She paused. "And I think, though I am an old woman and may be wrong, that this is precisely what Draven needs, and precisely what Edric cannot allow." The warning proved itself that same evening. June was returning from the healing chamber through the east corridor when she heard voices from behind the heavy door of the castle's small council room. A room she had no business being near, and would have continued past without stopping, except that she heard her own name. She stopped. She knew that listening at doors was not honorable. She listened anyway. Lord Edric's voice, controlled and deliberate. "The Ashford woman has no standing, no alliance value, and no understanding of court life. If the king formalizes this attachment, the Corrin alliance collapses. Lord Edwin will withdraw his troops from the border agreement before the first snow melt." A second voice, one she did not recognize, rougher and lower. "Then we ensure the king sees her true nature before he formalizes anything." "I will not fabricate slander," Edric said sharply. "I have never needed to." "Not slander, evidence. The girl has a sister. The sister is cooperative." A silence. June's blood went cold. "What has been offered?" Edric asked. His voice was quieter now. "A noble title, a match with a family of standing, something the sister has wanted her entire life and been denied." The rougher voice carried a smile in it that June found deeply unpleasant. "She is willing to testify that her sister has spoken against the crown, that she came to the castle not out of duty to the summons, but with a calculated intent to—" "Enough," Edric said. "I will not hear the details. Arrange it cleanly." Footsteps moved toward the door. June walked. She did not run. Running in castle corridors drew attention. But she moved quickly and quietly back toward the east wing, her heart striking hard against her ribs, her mind moving faster than her feet. Mara. Of course it was Mara. And yet, even knowing everything she knew about her sister, the confirmation of it landed in her chest like a blade finding a gap in armor. Not surprise. Something worse than surprise. The particular pain of having a fear proven true. She had three choices. She could say nothing, wait for whatever Mara had agreed to provide, and face it when it arrived. She could go to Sarah, who was wise but had no direct power in this. Or she could go to Draven. She stood in the empty corridor and breathed the cold stone air and made herself think clearly. Sarah had said, "Not frightened, careful." She went to Draven. He received her in his private study, a room she had not yet seen, reached through 2 guarded doors and a narrow staircase. It was a large, spare room with stone walls and a fire that had been burning long enough to take the edge off the cold without fully warming it. Maps covered the central table, weighted at the corners with iron discs, and shelves of bound ledgers and parchment scrolls lined 2 walls. The room smelled of ink and candle wax and the pine resin from the fire. He was standing at the table when she entered, and he turned with the look of a man who had been deep in something and was resurfacing. When he saw her face, he went still. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it. The corridor, the voices, Edric's careful refusal of details that allowed him to keep his hands clean, the rougher voice she did not recognize, and Mara. She told him about Mara without softening it, because softening it would have been a kindness to herself rather than a service to him, and she was done putting her own comfort first when the stakes were larger than her comfort. He listened without interrupting. His face was very still throughout, and she had learned enough about him in 3 days to understand that stillness was not the absence of feeling. It was what he did with feeling when he needed to think. When she finished, the fire settled with a soft collapse of embers, and the room was very quiet. "You could have said nothing," he said. "If Edric's plan had succeeded, you would have been discredited and sent home. You would have been safe." "I know," she said. "Why did you come to me instead?" June looked at him across the map-covered table, across the candle flames and the ink-smelled air and the careful distance that 3 days in a castle had not yet closed. "Because you told me you were afraid of making wrong choices," she said, "and I thought you deserved to have the right information to make this one." Something moved through his face, something that began behind his eyes and traveled slowly outward, the way warmth travels from a fire through a cold room, reaching the walls last. He crossed to her side of the table and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the firelight moving in his pale eyes. He reached out and took her hand, both of his hands around hers, the leather of his bracer warm from the fire, his grip firm and deliberate and gentle all at once. "Lord Edric will be removed from his position at first light," he said. "The man with him will be found. Your sister—" He paused. "Your sister will be dealt with justly, not cruelly, but justly." He looked at her. "I will not allow anyone in this castle to harm you. That is not a promise I make lightly. I do not make promises lightly." June looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. "I believe you," she said. And she did. Not because it was easy, or because she had stopped being afraid, but because she had learned, from her mother, from the cold valley mornings, from every difficult thing she had carried alone, that trust was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to move forward anyway, toward something true, even when the ground was uncertain. He brought her hand briefly to his lips, a brief, respectful touch, a promise sealed in the old way, and released it. What followed in the days after was not simple, and it was not without pain. Lord Edric Vane was relieved of his position the following morning, as Draven had promised. He left the castle without resistance, his face carrying the expression of a man who had calculated the odds and found them changed beyond recovery. He retired to his family's lands in the southern provinces, and the council found that without his careful arrangements, holding everything in its rigid place, certain things that had been forced now settled into shapes that fit better. The man with the rougher voice, a minor noble named Cassian, who had long served as Edric's instrument in matters Edric preferred not to touch directly, was brought before the king's justice and stripped of his title. He confessed quickly, and his confession was thorough. Lord Corrin and his daughter departed the castle within 2 days. Lady Corrin, to her credit, said nothing unkind as she left. She paused once in the great courtyard and looked at June across the cobblestones with those sharp green eyes, and something in her expression shifted, the pity gone, replaced by something closer to recognition. She inclined her head, a small and genuine gesture, and then she climbed into her carriage and was gone. The Corrin alliance was renegotiated in the months that followed, on terms that did not require a marriage, and Lord Edwin proved, in the end, more flexible than Edric had believed. Mara came to the castle, not brought by force, summoned formally by the king's messenger, and she came because she had no real choice. She arrived pale and rigid and prepared, June thought, for punishment. What she received instead was a conversation, with June, alone, in the small walled herb garden where the first snowdrops were beginning to press through the frozen earth. It was not an easy conversation. It was not a short one. June said things she had never said aloud, and Mara listened with the expression of someone hearing something they had known for a long time, but had never allowed to become words. There was no grand reconciliation, no tearful embrace, no sudden erasure of years of small cruelties, but there was, by the end, something that had not existed before, a silence between them that was honest rather than armed. Mara returned to Greywood Valley. She did not receive the noble title she had been promised, But she was not punished beyond the weight of her own actions, which proved over time to be considerable enough. Edmund Ashford, June's father, came to the castle in the spring, when the pines along the road had turned the pale bright green of new growth and the air smelled of thaw and river water. He stood in the great courtyard with his weathered face and his worn boots, and looked up at the castle walls with the expression June had last seen on his face when he had held the sealed parchment in their cold cottage and not known what to say. Draven met him at the gate himself. Not with ceremony, simply walked out and extended his hand, and Edmund Ashford, who had worked his small parcel of land every day of his life, and shown his feelings slowly, and only when certain of them, shook it without a word, and that was that. The wedding was held in midsummer, in the great hall where it had all begun. But the hall looked different now, or perhaps June looked at it differently. The iron chandeliers still held their candles. The stone floor was the same gray stone, but the light was warmer, or she was warmer, or both. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, simply cut, with her mother's silver bracelet on her wrist, and her blonde hair braided and pinned with a single sprig of rosemary from Sarah's garden. Sarah herself stood near the front, small and sharp-eyed, and entirely unsentimental. And when June caught her gaze during the ceremony, the old healer gave her a nod that contained in its economy everything that a longer gesture would have said. Draven stood at the front of the hall in his dark armor and his fur mantle, and when June walked toward him, he watched her come the way he had watched her that first evening across the crowded hall, with that quality of complete attention, the world reduced to a single point. When she reached him, he took her hand and held it the way he had in the study, with both of his, firm and deliberate and gentle. The kingdom of Veldrath did not become perfect. No kingdom does. There were hard winters and difficult councils and border disputes that took months to resolve. Lord Edric's absence left gaps that took time to fill, and filling them required June to learn things she had never imagined needing to know. The names of trade agreements, the logic of border treaties, the careful language of diplomatic correspondence. She learned them. She had always been good at learning things. And in the quiet hours, the early mornings when the castle was still, when the frost lay on the herb garden and the sky was the pale gray of old pewter, she and Draven walked together along the stone corridors or sat beside the fire in his study, and they talked the way they had talked in that first cold garden. Honestly, without performance, saying the true things and leaving space for the things that were not yet ready to be said. He slept better in time. The shadows beneath his eyes lightened. He laughed occasionally, not often, and not loudly, but genuinely, the way a person laughs when they have forgotten to guard against it. And June, who had stood at the edge of a great hall in a plain gray cloak and told herself she would not cry, who had carried her own weight alone for so long that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to set it down, June found, gradually and then all at once, that the castle had stopped feeling like something she was surviving. It felt like home. Not because of the wide hearths, or the warm blankets, or the rooms larger than she had ever known, but because of a man with tired eyes who had crossed a room full of silk and jewels to stand in front of her and see, without being told, that she was hurting, and who had never once, from that moment to this, asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. She stood one evening at the window of their chamber, looking out over the courtyard as the first stars appeared above the castle walls, the night air carrying the smell of pine smoke and cold stone and the distant river, and she thought of her mother, of that brave woman who had faced everything without flinching, and she felt, quietly and completely and without any reservation at all, that she had done the same. The story of June Ashford and King Draven of Veldrath did not end that evening at the window. Stories of people who are still living do not end, but it was, by every measure that mattered, a beginning that had become something whole, and that was enough.